Well, good morning. I'm delighted to be here, and this is my second Osher class. Last spring, I had the good fortune to present on Cuba and the United States, and it will now be here in the fall that I get to take a look at a place where I've had a chance to live for extended periods, which was really my entry into the field as a Latin Americanist, and that's Panama. You know, it was years ago that I was asked by the dean at Vanderbilt to think about the most ecumenical topic, a course that would cover as many disciplines and bring in as many different schools at Vanderbilt as possible. And the first thing that came to mind was Panama. With Panama, I was able to look at its developments through the lens of history. I was able to consider the relations between a large state and small state, Panamanian-US relations, using political science, the work of the Afro-West Indians in Panama to create first the French project as well as the United States Canal project allowed me to collaborate with African-American diaspora studies. We looked at the writings of many of Panama's leading scholars, bringing in the Spanish and Portuguese departments. And then, in looking at the actual construction of the canal, I was able to work with colleagues in engineering to explain exactly how a lock canal operates. As well, we brought in some of the leading epidemiologists to explain how the campaign to eradicate malaria and yellow fever was carried out in the early 20th century. And so Panama, a small country, is a huge window into so much. It is truly a crossroads of the world. And so I remember even back in graduate school when my mentor suggested that I go down and live in Panama, that I write a dissertation on Panama, I thought, well, maybe I should focus on one of the bigger countries in Latin America. And he said, no, Panama will allow you and afford you the opportunity to look at so many different things. And if you consider Panama thematically, the sky's the limit. And that's really been the case. So I have felt very fortunate to have worked on Panama all these years, and I'm currently writing on 20th century Panamanian politics, looking specifically at developments from the 1930s onward, focusing on two of Panama's most important statesmen, Armódio and Arnulfo Arias Madrid, two brothers that really dominated Panamanian politics from the 1930s through to the 1980s. Well, what I'd like to do today is to give an overarching introduction to some of the topics that I'll consider over the next 5 weeks. And so, to get us started, I wanted to have a few quotes here that I see as touchstones for the topic of the canal itself. You know, it's often been said that the United States, in so many ways, was fixated on Cuba due to its proximity. But I would also say that the United States, on and off again, in an intermittent fashion, has been fixated on Panama. And so here you see a quote from William Howard Taft: "The day is not far distant when 3 stars and stripes at 3 equidistant points will mark our territory, one at the North Pole, another at the Panama Canal, and the third at the South Pole. The whole hemisphere will be ours, in fact, as, by virtue of our superiority of race, it already is ours morally." Intense statement. You all might remember the debate over the Panama Canal treaties and one of the quotes from Senator Hayakawa was, "We should keep the Panama Canal. After all, we stole it fair and square." And one of the most implacable foes of the canal treaties, of course, was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, having, of course, not read the Panamanian Constitution or the way in which the relations between the United States and Panama vis-a-vis the canal zone was created, said, quote, "We built it, we paid for it, it's ours, and we're going to keep it," end quote. Well, on the other end of the spectrum was Omar Torrijos. Omar Torrijos would negotiate the Panama Canal treaties with President Jimmy Carter, and his view obviously was quite different. And he stated the following, quote, "Regarding the Panama Treaty negotiations, they will find us standing up or dead, but never on our knees. Never." End quote. So, you can see that this obviously is a highly charged issue. It goes back to the way that Panama became a nation. Some would say that its autonomy was aborted at its inception, and we'll talk about the sordid way in which Panama gained its independence. No story on Panama would be complete without Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, understanding how politics worked in Washington, realized that if he could shift the focus from a debate over the U.S. role in Panama to a debate over him, then the canal project would be able to move forward. And so he stated, quote, "I took it. The Panama Canal would not have started if I had not taken hold of it, because if I had followed the traditional or conservative method, I should have submitted an admirable state paper to Congress. Accordingly, I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me," end quote. Vintage TR. Well, I thought that I would start with just some disparate facts, some things about Panama that most of you may already know, but these are things that in one way or another I'll address at future points. Well, Panama geographically is indeed a crossroads of the world by virtue of the fact that both the Atlantic and Pacific border the two coasts very close by, some 50 miles apart. So Panama is the only place where you can see the sunrise on the Pacific and set on the Atlantic due to the tilt of the country. There are also sites in the interior of Panama where you can see both coasts at once. Christopher Columbus visited in 1502, and Vasco Nuñez de Balboa arrived to explore the area in 1513. The earliest recorded mention of a canal through Panama was made by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was King Charles I of Spain, and that was in 1534. Panama was the first Latin American country to adopt U.S. currency as its own. The population of Panama in 2016 was estimated by the UN at just a little under 4 million, which placed it as number 132 in population among the 233 nations of the world, smallest population in Central America. The cargo ship Ancon was the first vessel to transit the canal, August 15th, 1914. I always point out that one of the ironies of history was that after such effort and such expenditure of treasure, when this engineering miracle opened, it was precisely at the moment that the guns of August began in Europe, kicking off World War I. And the beginning of World War I eclipsed, in many ways, this phenomenal moment in world history with the opening of the Panama Canal. The city of Panama boasts the oldest, longest, continuously running municipal council in the Americas, American continent, not including the Caribbean. The oldest continually operating railroad is in Panama, travels from Panama City to Colón and back. Panama has the second largest duty-free zone in the world, the Colón Free Zone, second in size only to Hong Kong. The canal generates over 1/3 of Panama's entire economy. That is phenomenal. There are two basic seasons in Panama: the dry season from December to April, and the rainy season from May to November. And to speak on that point, I've had the opportunity to teach abroad in many places, and one of them was in Panama. And I remember that I had a class that met a little after 2 in the afternoon in what would be our fall semester, so it was during the rainy season in October and November. And we had to set ground rules for the students. In other words, if the torrential rains began and you already weren't in the building but were somewhere in transit, it was understood that you would take cover and wait it out if you could. On other occasions, it was open-ended. People would arrive when they could. And so I had to be very flexible, shall we say, in terms of when people would show and under what circumstances. But really, it was such that you have to work around the conditions. And the rainy season is certainly a wonder to behold. Control of the Panama Canal reverted to Panama midnight on December 31st, 1999. It was a rather low-key affair. The United States representative was Jimmy Carter and not the sitting president at the time, and I'll talk when we get to that topic what the significance was of that. So just some facts and some overarching themes that I will return to over the next 5 weeks. So geography has been hugely important in shaping Panama's role in global history. It, from the outset, was a staging point after the encounter of Old World and New. It would be the place where Francisco Pizarro would organize his expedition to Peru. It would be a jump-off point for many of the further Spanish entradas into various parts of Latin America. It, from the outset, was a crossroads. It would be across the Isthmus of Panama that the Spanish would transit their precious specie, their gold and silver, for travel back via Havana to Spain. And it has been at the forefront of world geopolitics in so many important ways. It was part of Spain's empire. It then became part of Gran Colombia, along with Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. It then was, for a while, seen as a forgotten province of Colombia proper, and finally became independent in 1903. But Panamanian history and its story can't be told without a look at external influence and domination. So a long period of Spanish colonial control, as I said, a forgotten province of Colombia, or at least it felt that way to many Panamanians, as I'll explain. And of course, the United States' role there, the legacy of the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty, which has shaped Panama until the present day. Again, an interesting fact, Panama's destiny as an independent nation was signed off on by the Secretary of State of the United States and a minister plenipotentiary who was French. There was not one single Panamanian available when the initial treaty that created Panama was set down into written form. So again, out of curiosity, how many of you have been to Panama? Hands up. Phenomenal. So a good number of folks have been to Panama, and how many of you have, in your visit then, transited the canal? Wonderful, wonderful. I started to feel for a while when I was living there as a tour director, everyone who came down wanted to transit the canal, and it never, for me, got old. I enjoyed it every single transit, whether it was full or partial. I was always amazed and saw different things and experienced. But, of course, here is the map showing Panama's position and kind of its unique tilt. You know, many folks assume that it is situated in a strict east-west dynamic, and, of course, that's not the case, as those of you who visited are surely aware. Here are some images of the canal itself and what at one time was the canal zone. You see here in the inset the various locks, and I will later on talk about the Third Locks project and the challenges that it presented and what's happened since its opening. But this is the U.S. Canal and the passing through the Culebra Cut. Of course, the free trade zone in Colón, second only to Hong Kong in terms of the value of commerce entering and exiting. So, looking at things chronologically, we start with the arrival of Vasco Nuñez del Balboa, and here is the famous statue that was presented to Panama by Spain of the famous Balboa, who is said to have been the first European to look out over the South Seas and exclaim, "Que Pacifico," in other words, how calm, how passive the water, and thus, legend says, the name stuck, Pacific. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, he would be the first to really see Spain's power in the Western Hemisphere expand considerably. And he would be the first, when told of the geographical dynamics of Panama, to suggest that this might be a perfect transit point, that a canal of some sort could potentially be created that would connect the two seas. You know, Charles V was an interesting figure. There were many who believed that he represented the extension of Christendom around the globe. This is a time when Spain's power was near its peak under Charles V and his son Philip II. And truly, the Spanish Empire extended all over Europe. They had territories in North Africa, throughout the Caribbean, in North America, Mesoamerica, South America, and with Philip II in Asia as well, with the Philippines, named for Philip. And so there were those who argued this is the moment where Christendom will be spread throughout the globe, and the agent of that, many argued, was Charles himself. Though he would go into early retirement saying that he had been exhausted from all his travels, spending time in Spain, spending time in the Low Countries, which is where he was from, spending time in the German-speaking areas trying to deal with a recalcitrant priest by the name of Martin Luther. And he said, you know, I'm tired. And he stepped down, he went into retirement, and the story goes that he had this massive room full of clocks. And his goal was always to try to get all the clocks to strike simultaneously. And he never succeeded. And he said, you know what? This is very much like my empire. It's heterogeneous. It's hard to get everything organized. And he told his son Philip, you will be faced with a monumental challenge trying to administer and govern this massive worldwide empire. Well, you can see here the dynamics of Spain's commercial network, the various nerve centers or choke points of the empire. The Spanish used a mercantilist system, and it meant that they tried to keep their rivals out. They tried to hermetically seal their empire, and so they wanted all goods and services to flow through certain set port cities. And here you see them. These are some of the important cities that the Spanish used. Havana, of course, would be the staging point for the return of the fleets to Spain. But you see as well, Veracruz being one of the key cities, as well as Portobelo in Panama, Cartagena, north coast of Colombia. So these were all of the major areas over which Spanish goods and services flowed. Here you see the Camino Real. This is the King's Highway, as it was sometimes referenced. And the Camino Real allowed, well, the crown's principal commodity that it was most concerned with was gold and silver, the flow of gold and silver. It was silver that was the liquid capital that kept the Spanish Empire operational. And so it was over these royal roads that the gold and silver flowed. They were carefully monitored. And from these roads, the goods were taken to places like Portobelo to then be transshipped back to Spain via Havana. So for those of you who visited Panama, did you get a chance to go to Panama Viejo, the old ruins of the original Panama City? How many of you have been to the ruins? It's a UNESCO site, and it's phenomenally interesting. So this is where the Spanish originally had created their organized town center. And so you've got on the grid square the church, the cabildo, the buildings that house the local government. Some of the wealthiest folks would live as close to the city center as possible. And so this was the original Panama City. It's not far from the airport, but it was in an area that was not secluded, that could be easily reached. And considering that Spain was such a target for pirates and marauders and privateers who would attack Spanish port cities along with Spanish ships on the high seas, Panama City was a place where Captain Henry Morgan attacked and raided the city. These are the ruins that are still left. This is the original church in Panama Viejo, the old Panama. So, along with some of the sea dogs, such as Sir Francis Drake, there were others. Captain Henry Morgan leads a raid in 1671 against the original Panama City. And the story goes, if you're familiar with the tides and the currents, when the tides go out on the Pacific side, on occasion, based on the movement of the heavens and earth, they can go way out. And so Henry Morgan's insurgents began the long trek through the mucky soil, arrive in Panama City, and begin to lay waste to everything. They torched it, they looted, they took what they could, and returned back with their riches. But one of the things that Captain Henry Morgan and his men missed was a golden altar. This golden altar was originally in the cathedral in Panamá Viejo. And what happened was a quick-thinking parish priest got together some folks and they painted over the altarpiece and covered it, turned it black. And so those who had arrived to loot weren't aware of the tremendous value of this altarpiece. They got just about everything else, but they didn't get this. And so this is from the church of San Jose in what's known as Casco Viejo. That is the site now, the downtown of modern Panama City. As I mentioned earlier, so on the Atlantic side, there was this important area where trade fairs were carried out, where goods entered and exited, and this is Portobelo. And so Portobelo would have fortifications, does have. They are modest in comparison to places like Havana or to Cartagena or even to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, but nonetheless, they were designed to defend Spanish interests and Spanish commerce in this long period. This would be one of the major choke points of the Spanish Empire. Beyond Panama's role in Spain's empire, in the early 19th century, all of continental Spanish America gains its independence. And so by 1830, the only two territories left in the Americas under Spanish control were Cuba and Puerto Rico. With this new arrangement and the creation of a number of new republics, we have, beginning in 1819, the foundations for Gran Colombia. Gran Colombia, as such, would last until 1831. There would be rivalries between the administrative departments, the erstwhile states, particularly between Venezuela and Colombia, and it would end eventually to the breakup of this entity in 1831. With that breakup, Panama remains part of Colombia and will be a Colombian province all the way up until 1903. Well, in the late 1840s, in the United States, in what was newly acquired territories, remember, from 1846 to 1848, the United States fights in what's known as the Mexican War, or Mexican-American War, and when it's over, Mexico loses over half of its territorial integrity. And part of what was forfeited was California, and in California, and this is Mexico's luck, just shortly after this territory was taken by the United States were some of the greatest gold finds in history. And so thus begins the gold rush out to the West Coast, people in the East looking for the quickest and most effective way to get from the eastern seaboard to the West Coast, to San Francisco in particular. Well, one of the ways by sea was going all the way down through the Straits of Magellan and around, a massive journey, a dangerous journey. One other option was to take a steamship down to Central America and cross either in Nicaragua or in Panama. In fact, one of those who was involved in the movement of people to Central America on their steamships was Cornelius Vanderbilt. And so he would be intricately involved in some ways in events that would transpire in Nicaragua. There would be a filibuster by the name of William Walker, who would take control in the midst of a civil war in Nicaragua of Nicaragua. One of the first things that he demanded was that the official language would be English. He wanted to create a Southern style, meaning bringing slaves from the southern United States down into Nicaragua. Well, he was eventually overthrown, and he was told that if he attempted to ever return and take power again, that he would be captured and put to death. And that's precisely what happened. Cornelius Vanderbilt was one of the folks that helped to overthrow William Walker. William Walker was also from Nashville, Tennessee. I think there's still a, okay. I hadn't seen it in a while because it's in an out-of-the-way place. It's not a place where you can easily stop and, you know, read it and take it all in. But, yeah, so in 1855, the United States undertakes the building of the Panama Railroad. It was a tremendously difficult undertaking. Again, because of the rainy season, because of malaria and yellow fever, simply trying to get a rail line across the isthmus cost many lives, but in the end it was achieved. And so this became a much shorter option for those seeking to arrive in California for the gold rush. You can imagine some of the folks that this transit would attract. You've got a lot of folks who are on the margins of society, kind of, you know, outlaws and whatnot that show up and begin to settle in and around the Panama Railroad. And just to kind of solidify why this would be of great use and utility, you see how much shorter the journey is by traversing the isthmus as opposed to traveling around South America. Well, it wouldn't be long until conflict would arise between Panamanians and U.S. nationals who were traversing the isthmus. And there in 1856 is an infamous or notorious affair known as the Watermelon War, or the Watermelon Incident. And we'll look at this in greater depth because it says a lot about the nature of U.S. Colombian / Panamanian relations at that midpoint of the 19th century. But in short, what took place was a U.S. national had come to a fruit stand where a vendor was selling various fruits and wares, and he took what he wanted and failed to pay. And thus ensued a heated discussion that spilled over into violence. And in the end, there were several who were killed, and the United States sent down officials to write a consular report to explain how could this have happened, what were the circumstances that led to this. And coming from it was a report that was very dismissive of Panamanian demographics, the nature of race relations. What had inflamed the situation was the fruit vendor was an Afro-Panamanian, and the person who took without pay the watermelon was a white U.S. national, and thus there is infused in this incident all kinds of things, issues of race, issues of the behavior, some of the overbearing actions of U.S. citizens as they went through Panama, feeling as though, the law there didn't apply to them, that they could do as they pleased. And so this created serious tensions between Panamanians and, in a larger sense, the Colombian government and the United States. Have any of you heard of the Watermelon War? Some have used this as a really interesting window into the mid-19th century and all that was taking place immediately after the construction of the Panama Railroad. So it's one of the things that I'll look into as we move forward. So today's just the broad panoply of themes and topics. And then I will unpack and break down all of those things in the 5 weeks to come. So just a few decades later, the French undertake the building of a sea-level canal through Panama. And the central figure in all of this was Ferdinand de Lesseps, a remarkable person. He had succeeded in having the Suez Canal constructed through the desert in Egypt, bringing then together the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, allowing the Europeans a way to get, particularly for the British, to get from the British Isles to their important colony of India in the Indian subcontinent in a far easier manner than having to circumnavigate Africa and the Cape. Ferdinand de Lesseps was a person of boundless energy, tremendous confidence, was convinced that he could replicate what he had done in Suez in Panama, not taking into account that those two places had very different flora and fauna, very different topographies, very different climates. And he was stubborn in insisting that it be a sea-level canal. From the very outset, when his plans were put forward, there was a gathering of engineers in France, and one of them stood up and said, the only way you're going to get up and over the Continental Divide, the mountains in the interior of Panama, is by a lock canal system. And Ferdinand de Lesseps never believed that that would be necessary. He felt that sheer willpower, that with the French working around the clock, that they could dig their way through and make it happen. And this became it became, at least financially for France, one of the greatest scandals that the nation had ever faced. There were a number of bond issues made. People invested heavily in trying to get this canal built. Vast sums of money were spent. Worse still, the French treated this as though it were a challenge that one would liken to going to war. People would travel over and never come back. The French lost some 20,000 plus workers, engineers, administrators in trying to get this canal completed. And in the end, they were able to finish roughly 40% of what they set out to do, which is more than most people had assumed. When the U.S. overtakes the project and begins their own canal, some 40%, though in great disorder had been done. And so this is the Grand Francais. You know, he was larger than life, and he would be the figure who drives this forward. You see the monument to him at Suez. The French set up their headquarters in not far from Casco Viejo, in the center of the new Panama City, and this would be their base of operations. It is really remarkable what they were able to accomplish and achieve based on the technologies of the time and what was available to them in terms of medicines and prophylaxis to prevent, you know, the French died in droves from yellow fever and malaria. They did not understand that the vector for those diseases was the mosquito, and so they undertook various efforts to try to clean portions of the city, to sanitize. They thought that by having kind of the areas in the city being open, no screens, open windows, that it would facilitate the movement of the bad ethers out of the room. At one of the French hospitals, for instance, they wanted to make sure that the patients didn't have insects near or on them or crawling up the sides of their bed, ants and things of the sort. So they made sure to put little pots of water around the legs of the bed. The perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. There were 14 Carmelite nuns who were sent to oversee one of the French hospitals. And within a year, 12 of them had died. So this was a tremendous catastrophe on a human level, on a financial level. I don't know if any of you in your travels to Panama were able to go to the French cemetery. Any of you have a chance to see that? It's remarkable. I just kind of would walk through and get a snapshot of who some of these people were. It does list kind of the role that they played, if they were chief engineer, and it's quite humbling to see the toll that was taken on those who went for the glory of France to succeed in building this canal. Just quickly, the latter part of the 19th century, just as the French Canal project fails and the French are forced to leave, it's a moment where the United States has undertaken industrialization, where the United States has undergone a process of urbanization, and where there has been a mass wave of immigration, mostly from Southeastern Europe. And the end result is that by the late 19th century, the United States is poised to expand its power beyond the continental United States. One of the leading templates for U.S. expansion was a work written by Alfred Thayer Mahan at the Naval War College that said the United States needed to be a naval power, and it needed to be able to project its power in two oceans, to have a two-ocean navy. And so the center of that argument placed Panama or Nicaragua as where this canal should be built in order to facilitate the rise of American naval power and the creation of a two-ocean navy. And so here you see kind of a schemata that looks at the things that enabled the United States to gain a position of dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Certainly first and foremost would be the Spanish-American War, or the Spanish-Cuban-American War, where Spain would lose the last of its two colonies in the Caribbean, Cuba and Puerto Rico, and the United States would create a protectorate in Cuba and create a colony in Puerto Rico. You see some of the actual policies that are germane to what would happen in Panama. The Roosevelt corollary that would allow the United States to intervene unilaterally anywhere in the hemisphere, which led to heavy U.S. intervention in the Caribbean, particularly in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, as well as in Cuba and later on in Panama. It's what gives rise to the Panama Canal. After that, we see William Howard Taft's dollar diplomacy, where business interests enter in a big way into various parts of the Caribbean and Latin America. And then, of course, Woodrow Wilson, the United States would intervene directly in the Mexican Revolution, attacking Veracruz in 1914. So these are some of the things mentioned there: Alfred Thayer Mahan's sea power, and some of the other items that are germane, things that we took a look at when we considered Cuba. So we'll have a session on the way in which Panama gained its independence. One of the things that was made very clear to me when I lived and taught in Panama, particularly when I was at the university there, there's often a saying that when it comes to independence, Panama is not a nation of heroes. They can't look back to their moment of independence as some legendary event where people rose to the fore and risked everything in an effort to break away from a metropole or mother country. There are those who say that Panama in many ways backed into independence, that it was heavily reliant upon machinations taking place in Washington and in New York, as opposed to anything that actually happened in Panama itself. It is important to know that there were voices in Panama who wanted to secede, who wanted to break away from Colombia. This wasn't something that was completely orchestrated by the United States and foisted upon unwilling participants. Nevertheless, when those who agreed to participate in the conspiracy realized that a deal had been made without their input by a French representative of the old French Canal Project, one of the chief engineers, Varela, when he signed the treaty, there were many in Panama who balked and said, this is not what we want. But they realized that because they had thrown their lot into this conspiracy, they were reminded by the United States, if they were at that moment to have backed out and the U.S. walked away and the territory, the province remained part of Colombia, they would all have been rounded up and shot for an act of treason. So they had to move forward despite their complete dissatisfaction with the way in which Panamanian independence had come about. And so here you see a political cartoon of the time. Bunal Varela to the left, kind of being the spark that brings about Panamanian independence, and of course Theodore Roosevelt there to happily bring it under United States auspices. The United States would undertake a process of nation building in Panama, as it did in Cuba, as it did in the Dominican Republic and Haiti after the first decade of the 20th century. Political pundits had a field day with all of this. You see Theodore Roosevelt kind of being shown here as an aggressor, as a bully, kind of grabbing Colombia by the neck and forcing it the independence of Panama. And then, of course, to the right, you see a representation of the Roosevelt corollary in all its glory. So again, to get back to Theodore Roosevelt's view, he believed that it was for the benefit of all of humankind and for civilization for a canal to be built through Panama. He was unwilling to countenance any counter-negotiations on the part of Colombians. The Colombian Senate had asked on a number of occasions that the United States consider paying a higher amount in order to undertake the canal project, and Theodore Roosevelt became reluctant to negotiate any further and decided that it was time for action rather than talk. So after Panama declared independence from Colombia, President Theodore Roosevelt attempted to quell suspicions that the U.S. had helped foment revolt in order to build the Panama Canal. Roosevelt asked Secretary of War Elihu Root if he had properly defended himself against accusations of wrongdoing. And Root reportedly replied, quote, "You certainly have, Mr. President. You've shown that you were accused of seduction and have conclusively proved that you were guilty of rape." End quote. Speaking truth to the great TR. Well, a good portion of what we'll look at over the next few weeks is the actual building of the canal itself. I will just, in a cursory way, mention here that the orders given by Theodore Roosevelt to the Panama Canal Commission was to make the dirt fly, and that was his expectation. There were 3 in total chief engineers who oversaw the U.S. Canal project. The first was John Wallace, whose oversight was a bit ill-fated, rather disorganized. He steps down in favor of a railroad man by the name of John Stevens. John Stevens was the one who figured out how to get the refuse, all of the digging, moved from these massive trenches to the areas where it should be placed, where it could be used as a breakwater. He was absolutely brilliant. He was the one who provided the funding that would allow for the campaign to eradicate malaria and yellow fever. There's no question that the canal could not have been built on time and under cost in the way it was without John Stevens. As you may know, John Stevens chose to step down, and the circumstances of that are still under debate. It absolutely infuriated Theodore Roosevelt. He knew how important John Stevens was. And so President Roosevelt then decided, I don't want to have any other chief engineers who can possibly resign on me. So I'm going to bring in the Army Corps of Engineers, and they for sure will not be able to step down. And so in came George Washington Goethals. He was the impeccably dressed, sort of persnickety chief engineer who made sure that everything was carried out exactly as it should be, and brought in some of the very best and brightest individuals who helped to make this lock canal project the success that it was. So, the United States Canal Project, these are just some of the themes that I will look at when we actually get to the details, but I'll look at its inauspicious beginnings. Actually, for the first months and almost for the first year of this project, the United States hadn't done much beyond what the French were capable of. In fact, there were those who said that the that the Yankees were more disorganized and had produced less than the French had. But things did change, particularly under John Stevens and Colonel George Washington Goethals. We'll look at the challenges presented by the Chagres River and attempts to dam it to create Lake Gatun, the roles played by Carlos Juan Finlay and William Crawford Gorgas in eradicating malaria and yellow fever. And we'll look at the role, the absolutely central role that Afro-West Indian labor played in building the canal. These were the pick and shovel guys. These were the ones who put in the dynamite and detonated the charges in order to actually build the canal. Many of them came from Barbados, many of them came from Jamaica, many of them came from other places in the Caribbean, and their role in the building of the canal was absolutely central. Many Panamanians resented the arrival of these Afro-West Indians, feeling that they were a foreign entity that didn't fit in the overall fabric of Panama. Namely, they did not speak Spanish, they were not Roman Catholic, and the worry was that they would stay after the canal project was over, which indeed was the case for many, and this became a source of contention. As I said, the canal opened in August of 2014. 1914. I'm kind of operating on automatic pilot here. I'm thinking ahead about what I need to edit. So we'll look at the monumental nature of the project itself, how the lock system operated, lifting ships up and over the Continental Divide. Here you see a photo from the Panama Canal archive that shows the arrival of these so-called silver men. They were on the silver rolls. They were paid in silver as opposed to those who were on the gold roll, which were U.S. citizens working on the canal project. Panama Canal Zone itself. The U.S. process of nation building, early 20th century. Again, the U.S. seeing its role as a mentor in helping Panama become a representative, constitutional governing nation. The first major shakeup in government in Panama happens in 1931. It's one of the things that I've researched carefully. It was the overthrow of the sitting government, and it ushers in these two brothers, Armodio and Arnulfo Arias Madrid. This is Armodio. He was a jurist. He had been trained in law at Oxford, and he was part of this group of upwardly mobile, foreign educated professionals who had helped to topple the sitting government in 1931. And here is his brother, one of the dominant figures, perhaps the most important statesman in 20th century Panamanian history, Arnulfo Arias. He would be a three-time president. He would never finish a single term of office. Every time he was overthrown, either by the military or the police. An incredible vote getter. He was a populist through and through. The problem became, once he was elected into office, he began to rule in a heavy-handed fashion. He had tremendous autocratic tendencies. Would try to govern without the legislature, would write his own constitution, and that got him in trouble. I guess it's part and parcel of the fact that he had been, when his brother Armodio was president from 1932 to 1936, Arnulfo had been in Europe as the representative of Panama in Europe and had actually represented Panama and interacted with both Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. And then after Arnulfo's first overthrow, he goes into exile and heads to Argentina and is hanging out with Juan Perón. And so some people figure, you know, how could he not be autocratic? One of the other main events that we'll look at are the flag riots of 1964. There had been a stipulation that the Panamanian flag should be flown alongside or with or in the Panama Canal zone. The Zonians did everything they could to keep that from happening, and it led to a violent event where Panamanian students went to Balboa High and attempted to raise the Panamanian flag. And a scuffle broke out, and it ended up with widespread fighting all along the canal zone. It led to an actual break in diplomatic relations, temporarily, between Panama and the United States. And there it is on the cover of Life magazine, 1964. A seminal event in Panamanian history was the October 11, 1968 coup d'etat, the overthrow, the golpe de Estado, the overthrow of Arnulfo Arias. Arnulfo Arias had just come to the presidency. He had been president for 11 days. He had an uneasy truce with the military. He promised that he would respect their autonomy. In fact, what he did from the very beginning, the military was going to hold a parade for Arnulfo Arias on his inauguration day. He skipped out, didn't go. The next thing he did was begin to send some of the high military staff on assignment abroad, which they didn't like. And so 11 days into his presidency, he was overthrown by a group including Omar Torrijos. And Omar Torrijos would become central to events from that point on. So 1968 to 1989 marks the time of military governance in Panama. Here, of course, is Omar Torrijos. Omar Torrijos would be at the center of the Panama Canal negotiations and the final signing of the Panama Canal treaties, 1977, here with Jimmy Carter, which would call for a staged handover of the canal territory, the canal zone, and finally the canal itself. Omar Torrijos died in a plane crash under suspicious circumstances in 1981. And following him in power in Panama was the guy that Torrijos had referred to as my gangster, Manuel Noriega. Manuel Noriega had been in charge of the G2. These were the intelligence unit within Panama itself. And thus begins a period with Noriega at the helm from 1983 to 1989. I'll go into tremendous detail about Manuel Noriega's double dealings with the United States and the narcotraficantes, the drug dealers in Colombia, Pablo Escobar and others. And what it, in the end, triggers is the invasion of Panama by the United States, the largest military intervention that the U.S. had undertaken since Vietnam at the time. This, again, 1989, Operation Just Cause. There are photos of the U.S. invasion that have been collected and are available in the archives. This shows an area close to what's known as El Chorrillo. And then this is the actual destruction. This is the area where Noriega had his base. This was his old neighborhood. This is kind of his headquarters. And that area was bombed. Many of those buildings were wood buildings, and the whole area burned down with tremendous loss of life. These two photos were taken less than a year apart. So you can see how one's fortunes can change dramatically. Noriega in the early days of January 1990, had gone to the papal nuncio, to the papal embassy in Panama City, seeking asylum. He eventually was apprehended there by the United States, brought back, put on trial in Miami, and was convicted for drug trafficking, along with a host of other charges, and was sentenced to 40 years, commuted to 30, and eventually, though only served up until 2007 when he was released, then was was incarcerated in France, finally came back to Panama, where he was held in prison until his recent death. Here you see the Panama Canal returned December 31st, 1999. The president of Panama, Mireya Moscoso, there with President Jimmy Carter. And our final topic, the one that we'll look at in our last session, the Third Locks Project, designed to accommodate the largest ships that the U.S.-built canal could no longer, the Panamax ships that could no longer go through the American-built canal. And so this, again, a monumental project. It was something that the Panamanians, many believed, couldn't be done. And in fact, it is open and functioning now as we speak. So that is a whirlwind overview of some of the topics. If you didn't love Panama before, maybe you do now. Or maybe you're just absolutely exhausted, I don't know which. But I thought it would be a good idea to really just kind of go through and show you what is to come, what are the major themes that I would like to consider over our next 5 weeks together. So I really look forward. I'm delighted you're here today. Thank you.